Part 1, When Children Ruled Kingdoms, the Early Nightmares. Hey guys, welcome back to another very calm, very sleepy historical ramble. So go ahead and dim the lights, adjust your pillows, let your brain melt a little, because tonight we're talking about something that really shouldn't have existed, but somehow did. Child monarchs. Yeah, kids, actual children, running entire kingdoms. If that idea alone makes you want to slowly close your eyes and exhale, trust me, the people living under them felt the same. Except their stress probably wasn't helping anyone sleep. Anyway, tonight we're drifting through some of the most quietly disastrous, gently chaotic, and surprisingly dangerous child rulers in history. Not the fun, Disney-style ones. The real ones. The ones raised by scheming regents, petty nobles, and whatever questionable genetics their parents decided to pass down. So just float with me as we glide into the first sleepy disaster of the night. The gentle storm of young King Henry VI of England. Let's start with someone who really just wanted to be left alone with his books and blankets. King Henry VI of England, crowned at 9 months old. Yes, not 9 years, months. He wasn't even old enough to sit upright without wobbling like an undercooked pudding. But England looked at this small baby, this soft, vaguely potato-shaped infant, and said, "Yep, that's our king. Perfect." Of course, Henry himself didn't know he was king. He was too busy trying to figure out what fingers were. But adults around him certainly knew, and they wasted no time turning his reign into the medieval equivalent of a multi-season political drama. Except everyone was sleep-deprived, vaguely malnourished, and related to each other in a way that seems concerning even by 1400 standards. So what was Henry actually like when he grew into something resembling a person? Well, imagine the least king-like king you can picture. Then lower the intensity by about 40%. Then sprinkle in a layer of gentle disappointment. Henry was extremely kind, extremely pious, and extremely not built for ruling a country. It was like giving a wet paper towel the job of holding up a cathedral. He meant well. He truly did. But the English crown required a level of political aggression that Henry could not produce even on accident. One of his biggest issues was that he didn't inherit the personalities of his warrior ancestors. His father, Henry V, had been a military powerhouse who won battles while probably still half asleep. Little Henry VI, meanwhile, preferred long prayers, quiet rooms, and maybe a nice warm cup of something calming. Not exactly the vibe England wanted during the 100 Years' War. So naturally, everything started slipping. France decided, actually, we'd like ourselves back. Nobles started whispering. The economy looked like it needed a nap and never woke up. Henry responded to all this stress with, well, nothing. He basically shut down. In 1453, he slipped into a catatonic state so deep that people had to check whether he was breathing or just dramatically ignoring his problems. He stayed like that for over a year, which honestly feels like a reasonable response to medieval politics. And because medieval England hated a power vacuum almost as much as it hated stable leadership, the Wars of the Roses kicked off like a slow-motion bar fight. Cousins fighting cousins, families splitting apart, and everyone blaming each other over who should babysit the crown. Meanwhile, Henry was just sitting there, blissfully unaware, mentally on a vacation far away from everyone. He eventually snapped out of it, but at that point his kingdom was so broken it would have taken an actual adult monarch with a functioning spine to fix it. Instead, they had Henry. His downfall was inevitable. He was deposed, restored, deposed again, imprisoned, and finally quietly removed from the equation under extremely suspicious circumstances. Let's just say natural causes did an impressive amount of work covering up royal inconveniences in the 1400s. And so, England closed the chapter on its gentle, soft-spoken baby king who never had a chance to become anything else. But don't drift off yet. Let's gently float toward another monarch who managed to be both a child and somehow a political nightmare. The very small, very stressed Charles VI of France. So, moving across the channel, let's talk about Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad. And yes, that was his actual nickname, because medieval Europe had the subtlety of a brick. Charles became King of France at 11 years old, which is exactly the age when most children are just discovering that deodorant exists. But France decided he was ready to command armies, negotiate with nobles, and rule a kingdom held together by string, Catholic guilt, and mild delusion. To be fair, Charles started out promising. People called him Charles the Well-Beloved. He smiled. He tried hard. He wasn't terrible. And then the stress began. Imagine being 12 years old and your schedule looks like this. Morning, meet powerful nobles who hate each other noon. Pretend to understand financial reports afternoon. Listen to your uncles argue about taxes evening. Deal with the English trying to invade again bedtime. Pray the monarchy doesn't collapse while you're asleep. It was a lot. Eventually, Charles cracked under the pressure. His first breakdown happened in his early 20s, when he suddenly became convinced that his advisors were plotting against him, which, to be fair, they probably were. But Charles responded by violently attacking his own men in a confused frenzy. After that, things just drifted downhill. Over the years, he suffered episodes where he forgot who he was, failed to recognize his family, believed his body was made of glass, and refused to be touched in case he shattered. Yes, glass. This wasn't metaphorical. He legit thought he was one unfortunate hallway bump away from becoming a million little pieces. It didn't help that France was a political swamp filled with ambitious relatives who used Charles's condition as a kind of royal tug-of-war rope. When he was lucid, everyone rushed to influence him. When he wasn't, they fought to control the regency. It was like medieval Game of Thrones, but nobody had plot armor, and the budget for functioning brain chemistry was zero. The real tragedy is that Charles wasn't mad in the way people joked about. Modern historians suspect he had a severe mental illness triggered by young age trauma, massive stress, and a genetic cocktail leftover from centuries of royal interbreeding. Basically, he was diagnosed by history with being born into Valois family politics. Charles's reign, unsurprisingly, ended with France politically shredded, socially exhausted, and widely confused about who was actually in charge. His son was sidelined. His queen was scheming. English forces were carving up the country like a buffet, but Charles drifted through it all in a haze, more lost than malicious. He was one of history's best examples of what happens when a child monarch grows up in a world that never gave them stability, structure, or even a chance to breathe. But let's drift to an even earlier century, to a child monarch who wasn't gentle, confused, or fragile. No, this next one was something else entirely. The ferocious energy of young Ivan IV of Russia. Now we glide into Russia, to the early life of Ivan IV. You probably know him as Ivan the Terrible, which tells you basically everything you need to know about how this story ends. But before Ivan became the Terrible, he was just the small child with an entire traumatizing backstory. Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at 3 years old, which is an age when most children aggressively negotiate for more snacks, not more territory. His father died suddenly because medieval diseases loved speedrunning, and his mother took charge as regent. Then she also died, possibly poisoned, because Russia. Ivan was left as a small, isolated child surrounded by boyars who were supposed to take care of him, but instead treated him like a political accessory. They ignored him, abused him, mocked him, and generally acted like unsupervised teenagers in a high-stakes power vacuum. Imagine being 8 years old, wandering a palace where everyone wants something from you except you. That was Ivan's childhood. So what did he do with all this emotional neglect? Well, his coping mechanism was, let's call it, unconventional childhood hobbies. He and his friends would roam the Kremlin looking for small animals, and not to pet them. He enjoyed throwing people off buildings. He verbally tore into nobles who underestimated him. Basically, he was already becoming the historical version of, don't leave this kid alone in a room with scissors. When he finally grew old enough to actually rule, he remembered very vividly how the boyars treated him. And because Ivan never learned emotional regulation, forgiveness, or really anything resembling healthy social behavior, he unleashed a reign that historians still describe using tones usually reserved for natural disasters. But here's the calm, sleepy part of this. Ivan didn't come out of nowhere. He was the product of a completely unstable, completely broken political environment that decided, let's make a traumatized toddler the center of government and hope for the best. Shockingly, the best did not happen, but we'll drift deeper into Ivan's later disasters in a later part. For now, let's float toward another child ruler who managed to be both unpredictable and painfully relatable. The quiet, lonely reign of Puyi, the last emperor of China now, gently glide into the early 20th century. A different world, a different culture, but the same tragic theme. A small child dropped into a collapsing empire. Puyi became emperor of China at 2 years old. 2. Still learning how to walk in a straight line, still emotionally fragile enough to melt down over the wrong bowl color. But somehow, that tiny child was placed on the dragon throne, declared the son of heaven, and surrounded by a palace full of frightened adults trying to keep an ancient system alive. Puyi had no idea what was happening. One moment he was a toddler in the nursery. The next moment he was being carried into the Forbidden City while terrified officials bowed so hard their foreheads nearly dented the floor. The first thing he remembered about being emperor was crying for his wet nurse because the adults wouldn't let her near him. They thought it was undignified for the son of heaven to need comfort. That pretty much set the tone of his entire childhood. He grew up in a silent palace where thousands of servants pretended not to exist unless he needed them. He was surrounded by endless rules, endless rituals, and endless reminders that he was simultaneously all-powerful and completely powerless. He technically ruled China, but in reality, the empire was already falling apart. Warlords spread across the land like mushrooms after rain. Foreign powers carved up influence zones. Reformists pushed for change. Revolutionaries wanted the monarchy gone. And Puyi, this tiny, lonely boy, was stuck in the center, with no idea what any of it meant. By age 6, he'd already been forced to abdicate. He didn't even understand the word. He asked, "Does that mean I'm not the emperor anymore?" And a court official quietly explained, "Well, yes, but also sort of." Not exactly the clarity a child needs. Puyi's life became a long, slow drift of other people using him for their agendas, politicians, generals, foreign governments, and even tutors who had no idea how to raise someone trapped between modernity and a vanished world. He was one of the gentlest child monarchs in history, and perhaps the saddest. A kid raised in a golden cage that slowly rusted around him will continue with more chaotic child rulers, from pharaohs to popes to the young monarchs who burned their kingdoms down through pure inexperience. Part 2. Pharaohs, pretenders, and the tiny monarchs nobody supervised, all right? Let's ease back in. If you've settled deeper into your blanket nest, perfect. Because we're drifting now into the ancient world, a place where the average life expectancy was short, illnesses were frequent, and somehow that made empires even more comfortable putting literal children in charge. Let's float first into Egypt, a kingdom of sun, stone, ceremony, and a few very small rulers who were nowhere near ready for this level of responsibility. Tutankhamun, the unprepared boy in the golden mask, so everyone knows King Tut because his tomb had the aesthetic of a royal-themed gift shop, and the media decided to market him like ancient Egypt's breakout celebrity. But behind the gold mask and dramatic museum lighting was a sickly, exhausted child who probably just wanted anyone, to make decisions for him. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at around 8 or 9 years old because ancient Egypt looked at this tiny, fragile boy and said, "Sure, let's put him in charge of an entire religious system, a bureaucracy of thousands, and a geopolitical sphere shaped mostly by arguments." To be fair, Tut wasn't expected to rule alone. He had regents, advisors, priests, courtiers, basically an entire swarm of adults who all thought they should be the real power behind the throne. But Tut had one major problem. His family tree was less a tree and more a tightly braided rope. A lot of branches looping back into each other. A genealogical boomerang. Whatever you want to call it, it wasn't ideal. Modern science basically confirmed that Tutankhamun's genetic pool had the diversity of a medieval family reunion in a small barn. He suffered from bone disease, a clubfoot chronic infections, and possibly epilepsy. His portraits show him standing tall and heroic. But the reality was probably a kid doing his best to stay upright. His reign mostly involved reversing the religious chaos caused by his probable father, Akhenaten, who had decided Egypt should become a one-god, sun-worshipping experiment. It didn't go well. So Tut's advisors used the young pharaoh as a symbolic reset button, quietly restoring all the old temples, the old gods, and the old political networks. Tut himself. He was mostly a ceremonial figure, a child dressed in gold, performing rituals he barely understood, smiling because everyone expected him to. And then he died at around 18 or 19, barely an adult. Barely anyone knew him, and his dynasty promptly fell apart like dry papyrus. Tutankhamun wasn't a dangerous child ruler. He was a helpless one, a kid shaped by the politics around him, not by his own choices. But don't worry. The next one on our list absolutely was dangerous. Let's drift toward Rome, Nero, the teen emperor who should absolutely not have been trusted. Okay, technically Nero wasn't a child when he became emperor, he was 16. which developmentally speaking still puts him firmly in the please don't give this person heavy responsibilities, sharp objects, or an empire category. But Rome didn't care. Rome said, yes, let this emotionally unstable theater kid rule the world. Nero's childhood was already a red flag parade. Father died, young mother exiled, then returned adopted by Emperor Claudius, raised with layers of trauma, ambition, and questionable role models. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the kind of parent who would absolutely run a modern PTA like a mafia network. She positioned Nero perfectly, too perfectly, then expected to rule through him. For about 5 minutes it actually worked. But teenage emperors do not enjoy being micromanaged. Nero soon decided he liked. Reenacting plays, singing dramatically, competing in artistic contests, he was definitely rigging appearing on stage like a celebrity with imperial privilege, and occasionally, conveniently removing political obstacles, not ideal behavior for someone controlling the largest empire on Earth. His early years involved an increasingly tense, slow-motion power struggle with his mother. Agrippina expected obedience. Nero expected freedom. Both expected to win. And because Nero had a rather flexible moral compass, he eventually arranged her death in a way that would be comical if it weren't horrifying. His first plan was to collapse the roof of a boat she was on, then a sabotaged ship, then various backup assassination methods. Let's just say Rome's secret services had a busy work week. After that, Nero drifted deeper into paranoia, impulsive decisions, and artistic obsession. He wasn't always the cartoon villain later writers made him out to be, but he also wasn't the calming, stabilizing leader Rome needed. He was basically a 16-year-old influencer given access to nuclear codes. Dangerous? Yes. Chaotic? Extremely. Preventable? Absolutely. But Rome loved its dynastic politics, and this is what it produced. Let's drift to a different tiny menace, one with a crown slightly too big for his head. King Richard II, the boy who loved drama more than diplomacy, Richard II became King of England at 10 years old, during one of the most tense periods in English history, the aftermath of the Black Death and the explosive social changes it caused. If ever there was a moment not ideal for child leadership, this was it. Richard's reign began with chaos. Within a year, the peasants' revolt erupted, tens of thousands of angry workers marching toward London, demanding change, chanting slogans, and carrying sharp objects. Richard's advisors panicked, but Richard stepped out to meet the rebels himself. To his credit, he handled it strangely well for a 10-year-old. He calmed the crowds with a mix of promises, bravado, and pure, I am small and fearless because I don't understand consequences, yet energy. But as he grew older, the bravery curdled into arrogance. Richard developed a taste for luxury, flattery, artistic theatrics, and punishing nobles who annoyed him. He wasn't incompetent, just extremely sensitive, extremely proud, and extremely committed to the idea that kings should be admired at all times. Unfortunately for him, English nobles were not spiritually capable of admiration. They rebelled. Richard got angry. He retaliated. They rebelled again. He retaliated harder. The whole reign became a long, slow, melodramatic standoff between a king who wanted emotional validation and an aristocracy that wanted fewer velvet curtains. In the end, Richard was quietly deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, partly because Richard alienated too many nobles, and partly because he genuinely forgot that kings need friends. Child monarchs tend to oscillate between two extremes: gentle, anxious, overwhelmed, or proud. Dramatic, overcorrecting Richard fell into the second category, and England paid the price. Let's drift deeper into Europe to a child whom history almost forgot, even though he technically ruled a continent. Charles II of Spain, the genetic accident nobody prepared for now. This next one, it's less dangerous child monarch and more dangerously unprepared child monarch. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg king of his line, was born with one of the most concentrated inbreeding coefficients in royal history. If the family tree had been a map, his would have been a roundabout. He wasn't king as a toddler, but he was essentially a child mentally and physically for most of his life. Charles had difficulty walking, difficulty chewing, developmental delays, chronic illness, seizures, near total political confusion. His advisors treated him like a symbolic figure, a royal paperweight whose job was simply to exist so the dynasty wouldn't collapse. The problem? Everyone knew he wasn't going to rule meaningfully. Everyone also knew he wasn't going to have heirs. So his entire life became one long international custody battle. Foreign powers fought over him like divorced parents fighting over a suitcase. Charles himself tried desperately to understand his duties. He prayed. He listened to advisors. He attempted to be king. But he was a child trapped in an adult body, and the adults around him acted like political vultures, circling from the moment he learned to walk. When Charles died, the War of the Spanish Succession exploded and tore Europe apart, all because one fragile, neglected child monarch had been thrust into a role no one could fill. Let's drift away from tragedy, toward the chaos of the Byzantine Empire, where child emperors were practically a hobby. Constantine VII, the child emperor who grew up in the shadows, Constantine VII became emperor of Byzantium at a few months old. Yes, another infant monarch. Because apparently medieval governments thought the best way to run an empire was to put a crown on a newborn and see what happened. Constantine's life became a slow-motion political relay race. As a baby, he was used as a political pawn as a child. He was overshadowed by co-emperors as a teen. He was sidelined by powerful generals as an adult. He was still treated like an intern. He spent most of his youth watching other people rule for him, his mother, his in-laws, assorted military leaders, and anyone else bold enough to walk into the palace. Constantine coped by becoming a scholar, a writer. A quiet, bookish emperor who preferred history to politics. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't dramatic. He was just tired. When he finally got true power, he ruled well, kindly, peacefully, intelligently. But he is a classic example of how growing up as a child monarch often means growing up invisible, overshadowed, or completely prevented from becoming yourself. A quick drift to the north, the tragedy of Erik V of Denmark. Erik became king at 12. Not the worst age to inherit a kingdom, except Denmark at the time was basically a simmering cauldron of noble rivalries. Erik, unfortunately, was proud, impulsive, and easily swayed by flattery. Child monarch energy at its finest. He made enemies quickly, raised taxes unwisely, fought with nobles, acted without restraint, and generally forgot that being king doesn't mean being invincible. Eventually, he was assassinated in a barn, a very undramatic end for someone who wanted to be a powerful medieval monarch. But Erik is a reminder that child rulers often don't gain wisdom, they gain entitlement. And entitlement plus medieval politics is never a calming combination. We'll continue with even stranger and more unpredictable young rulers, some who nearly destroyed civilizations, others who barely understood where they were. Part 3, Teen Tyrants, Holy Children, and the Monarchs Who Grew Up Too Fast. Welcome back. If you've sunk even deeper into the mattress by now, perfect. Because we're drifting into a section of history where teenage rulers made choices that absolutely nobody should have let them make. These next monarchs were young, stressed, poorly supervised, and caught somewhere between childhood and crisis. So pretty much the perfect bedtime material. Let's ease in with someone who technically became a ruler before he even understood language. Shapur II, the baby king crowned before birth. Yes, you read that right. Shapur II of the Sasanian Empire was crowned before he was born. So here's the situation. His father died. The empire needed a king. The nobles disagreed on who should rule. They wanted a safe option, someone who couldn't argue, rebel, or make them nervous. So they crowned the womb. They literally placed a crown on the belly of Shapur's pregnant mother and declared the unborn baby the king. This has to be one of the most astonishing, not my problem, decisions in ruling class history. Baby Shapur technically ruled from the moment he had eyelids. Now, of course, he didn't actually do anything as an infant monarch. Adults handled the complexities of empire building, diplomacy, and military affairs. Shapur mostly handled crying, napping, and being swaddled in a socially acceptable royal manner. But here's the twist. When Shapur eventually grew up, he turned out to be one of the strongest rulers of his entire dynasty. Competent, strategic, charismatic, which is kind of unfair to everyone else. Most child monarchs fall apart. Shapur was over here speedrunning, legendary. Imagine becoming king before birth, then growing into someone whose reign is remembered for actual structure and stability. It feels like cheating. Still, he's a reminder. Sometimes the least prepared monarch ends up handling things better than the ones who spent their whole childhood being tutored by stressed-out advisors who hadn't slept since the previous dynasty. But let's drift away from accidental competence and glide toward someone who leaned heavily into the chaos of youth. Mary, Queen of Scots, the royal child who never stopped running. Mary was 6 days old, barely old enough to recognize a ceiling, when she became Queen of Scotland in 1542. 6 days. That is an age when your biggest accomplishment is opening your eyes without panicking. But Scotland needed a monarch, and Mary happened to be the only one available. So the crown went on her tiny head, and the Scottish nobles immediately started fighting over who got custody of the monarchy. Mary's entire childhood was a prolonged political escape room. The English wanted her. The French wanted her. Scottish clans wanted influence through her. Her regents changed faster than the weather. Eventually, she was shipped off to France like a royal care package. There, she grew up in luxury, surrounded by French courts that liked her because she was charming, tall, and mildly exotic. They taught her languages, court etiquette, dancing, everything except how to manage a politically chaotic homeland filled with unpredictable nobles. Mary married the French Dauphin, who soon became King Francis II, making Mary both Queen of Scotland and Queen of France. For 1 year. Then her young husband died. Mary, now a teenage widow, was sent back to Scotland like a return-to-sender package. What she found was a country full of religious tension, rebellious lords, ongoing threats from England, and widespread suspicion about her loyalties. Mary tried to rule, but her upbringing had not prepared her for a kingdom that required more political teeth than polite diplomacy. She married unwisely, then disastrously, then catastrophically. Her husbands included a jealous cousin, a manipulative schemer, and a man who may have been involved in murder. Mary soon found herself imprisoned, forced to abdicate, and eventually fleeing to England, where she hoped for refuge and instead got house arrest under Elizabeth I. This was not the cozy sleepover Mary expected. Her story ends with execution, a tragic, quiet finish for a queen who never had time to grow into her responsibilities. Mary is a classic example of a child monarch whose life was defined by being too young, too visible, and too valuable to too many people. Let's drift gently to a more ancient world, where a teenage ruler nearly triggered the collapse of an entire religious system. Akhenaten, the teen pharaoh who rewired Egypt's religion overnight. Akhenaten, originally known as Amenhotep IV, took the throne as a teenager. We don't know his exact age, but historical estimates place him somewhere in the 16-18 range. So picture this: a teenage boy inherits Egypt, a world of gods, rituals, temples, traditions, and priesthoods older than most civilizations on Earth. And instead of saying, "Okay, I'll maintain this," he said, "No, thank you. I'm going to completely rewrite the spiritual backbone of this country because I think the sun god is kind of cool." It was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a teenager redecorating their entire house while their parents were out. Akhenaten introduced monotheism, or at least something close, declaring Aten, the solar disk, the only true god worth worshipping. He shut down traditional temples, defunded thousands of priests, changed the artistic style of Egypt, and even built a brand new capital city because apparently Thebes had the wrong aesthetic. This was a massive, ground-shaking shift. He wasn't dangerous in a violent sense, more in the creating an administrative meltdown because he felt spiritually inspired sense. What makes Akhenaten especially fascinating is that he didn't seem to care much about politics. He was consumed by religion, art, symbolism, a dreamy, detached, slightly otherworldly personality. But Egypt needed someone grounded. Instead, it got a teenage pharaoh who wandered around praising sunbeams and posing in elongated statues with his entire family painted like abstract sculptures. When he died, Egypt rapidly erased everything he did. His new city was abandoned. His religion was reversed. His images were smashed. His memory was scrubbed from kings' lists. It was the ancient equivalent of clearing your browser history and uninstalling a failed software update. Teenage impulses can be powerful. Akhenaten simply had the entire Egyptian state budget to act on them. But now let's float towards someone much younger and much more uncontrollable. Ivan V of Russia, the overwhelmed co-czar who didn't want the job before Peter the Great became, well, great. He had to rule alongside his older half-brother. Ivan was crowned co-czar at 16, but his mental and physical health were extremely fragile from childhood. The best way to describe him is a gentle boy trapped in a role that required brutal decisiveness. He suffered from chronic illness, developmental difficulties, and severe anxiety. He preferred quiet rooms, religious contemplation, and staying far away from political tension, which unfortunately made him the least qualified person to govern Russia, a country that practically runs on tension. His sister, Sophia, effectively ruled for him. Ivan nodded along to decisions, signed documents when prompted, and tried not to cry during official ceremonies when the pressure became too much. Court records describe him as timid, frequently overwhelmed, physically frail, emotionally distressed. He was not dangerous. He was not ambitious. He was simply unprepared. But Russia placed him on the throne anyway, partly to maintain family balance, partly to appease political factions, and partly because the Romanovs had run out of better options. He co-ruled for 21 years, but history remembers him mostly as a symbol, a boy who inherited a crown when what he needed was medical care, privacy, and a peaceful life. When he died, Peter, I took over fully, which was probably the first moment anyone felt like Russia was being driven by someone actually awake. Let's drift a bit west, toward a child ruler who managed to unite something very unlikely. Alphonse XIII of Spain, born a king, raised in a storm. Alfonso XIII came into this world already crowned. Literally. He inherited the Spanish throne at birth in 1886. Picture a newborn, pink and blinking, and then imagine a bunch of serious government officials bowing to him. Spain has never excelled at subtlety. His mother served as regent, but the political climate was a sandstorm. Military unrest, colonial collapse, economic instability, rising republicanism, conflicts in Morocco, and through all this drifted Alfonso, a child raised to believe he was Spain's natural savior. Not ideal for humility. As a young man, Alfonso took an active interest in politics, enthusiastically and often disastrously. His early decisions helped destabilize the country further, and his lack of tact made him deeply unpopular. By the time the Spanish Second Republic was declared, Alfonso had essentially talked himself out of his own kingdom. He wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel. He was a boy raised in an echo chamber of royal expectation, and when confronted with real-world politics, he handled it with the grace of a deer on an icy staircase. The short, strange rule of Emperor Huizong's young son, Emperor Qinzong in the Song dynasty. Emperor Qinzong inherited the throne during a full-scale invasion. He was young. He was inexperienced. He had absolutely no idea what to do with a collapsing empire. Qinzong panicked. A lot. His strategies were inconsistent. Negotiate, then fight, then surrender, then unsurrender, then panic again. The Jin dynasty eventually captured him, and he spent the rest of his life as a prisoner, a tragic, quiet ending to a ruler who never stood a chance. Sometimes youth isn't dangerous. It's simply heartbreaking. We still have many more child monarchs to drift through, some disturbingly violent, some painfully gentle, and some who ruled entire continents without fully understanding the words policy or budget. Part 4. The boy who was crowned mostly by accident, Wenceslaus III of Bohemia. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake after the last 3 installments, congratulations or my condolences. Either way, let's drift a little deeper tonight into another quiet royal catastrophe. This time, we're floating into the slightly foggy, slightly chaotic world of Wenceslaus III, the teenage king who basically inherited too many thrones to keep track of, and then lost all of them with almost impressive speed. So, settle in, adjust your blanket, maybe shift your pillow just a little, because this boy is one of those medieval figures where everything technically happened, but somehow nothing really happened at the same time. A perfect bedtime vibe. Wenceslaus III was born in 1289 as the only son of Wenceslaus II, the king of Bohemia. His father was one of those ambitious medieval monarchs who thought, why stop at one crown when you can hoard 3 and upset half of Europe? So naturally, little Wenceslaus was raised with the expectation that he'd eventually rule pretty much everything from Prague to Krakow. But here's the thing, he wasn't exactly built for the job. By the time he was 11, people were already whispering that he preferred lounging, drinking, and general teenage nonsense far more than actual king stuff. And honestly, who can blame him? If I were an 11-year-old suddenly told, congrats, you're also the titular king of Hungary now, I would also have chosen the medieval equivalent of staying inside and refusing to answer letters. But his father pushed ahead anyway. So at the ripe age of 12, Wenceslaus III was crowned king of Hungary. Well, crowned is a strong word. Hungary sort of half accepted him, half protested, and mostly ignored him. The nobles didn't like him. The clergy didn't trust him. The peasants couldn't pronounce his name. And the whole situation looked less like ruling a kingdom and more like being forced into a school project where nobody wants you on the team. Eventually, Hungary said, "Yeah, this isn't going to work," and politely, or maybe not so politely, booted him out. Now this is important. Being fired from a kingdom at age 12 is a very niche, very medieval experience. Most children worry about school. Wenceslaus worried about losing geopolitical legitimacy, but he shrugged it off, mostly. His father then pivoted and said, "Okay, fine, not Hungary, but you'll still inherit Bohemia and Poland." And because medieval parents were known for questionable emotional support, Wenceslaus grew up with the intense pressure to be a great king, while absolutely no one ever taught him how to be one. This becomes very obvious after his father died. At 16, Wenceslaus inherited Bohemia plus the ever-fragile Polish crown. He celebrated the way any overwhelmed teenage monarch might, with heavy drinking, ignoring his advisors, and making extremely questionable political decisions. His idea of diplomacy usually involved insulting someone important and then forgetting he had done so. He was, in short, not ready. Let's drift gently through his royal resume. He lost Hungary. He lost most of Poland soon after inheriting it. He alienated half of Bohemia's nobility. And he accidentally triggered a few civil conflicts because he never read the paperwork people gave him. Still, he had one big plan left, a military campaign to reclaim control over Poland. It was supposed to be his big comeback arc, his serious king moment. Instead, it became a medieval cautionary tale. In 1306, he marched into Poland with a small entourage, stopped in the town of Olomouc and decided to rest, which was honestly fair. But then someone stabbed him to death in his room, and to this day nobody is totally sure who did it. There are theories, of course. Assassins hired by rival nobles, a political conspiracy, a personal revenge attack, or maybe just someone tired of his whole teenage king energy. Whatever the cause, Wenceslaus III died at 17, the last male of his dynasty, leaving behind 3 empty thrones, several confused nobles, and a historical legacy that can be summarized as, he really tried, mostly. Let's drift away from his messy, slightly tragic teenage reign and float toward another royal disaster waiting patiently across the centuries. Because next up, we're moving to a child ruler who didn't lose kingdoms. He lost something arguably worse. Part 4. The boy who was crowned, mostly by accident, Wenceslaus III of Bohemia. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake after the last 3 installments, congratulations, or my condolences. Either way, let's drift a little deeper tonight into another quiet royal catastrophe. This time, we're floating into the slightly foggy, slightly chaotic world of Wenceslaus III, the teenage king who basically inherited too many thrones to keep track of, and then lost all of them with almost impressive speed. So, settle in, adjust your blanket, maybe shift your pillow just a little, because this boy is one of those medieval figures where everything technically happened, but somehow nothing really happened at the same time. A perfect bedtime vibe. Wenceslaus III was born in 1289 as the only son of Wenceslaus II, the king of Bohemia. His father was one of those ambitious medieval monarchs who thought, why stop at one crown when you can hoard 3 and upset half of Europe? So naturally, little Wenceslaus was raised with the expectation that he'd eventually rule pretty much everything from Prague to Krakow. But here's the thing, he wasn't exactly built for the job. By the time he was 11, people were already whispering that he preferred lounging, drinking, and general teenage nonsense far more than actual king stuff. And honestly, who can blame him? If I were an 11-year-old suddenly told, "Congrats, you're also the titular king of Hungary now," I would also have chosen the medieval equivalent of staying inside and refusing to answer letters. But his father pushed ahead anyway. So at the ripe age of 12, Wenceslaus III was crowned king of Hungary. Well, crowned is a strong word. Hungary sort of half accepted him, half protested, and mostly ignored him. The nobles didn't like him. The clergy didn't trust him. The peasants couldn't pronounce his name. And the whole situation looked less like ruling a kingdom and more like being forced into a school project where nobody wants you on the team. Eventually, Hungary said, "Yeah, this isn't going to work," and politely, or maybe not so politely, booted him out. Now this is important. Being fired from a kingdom at age 12 is a very niche, very medieval experience. Most children worry about school. Wenceslaus worried about losing geopolitical legitimacy, but he shrugged it off, mostly. His father then pivoted and said, "Okay, fine, not Hungary, but you'll still inherit Bohemia and Poland." And because medieval parents were known for questionable emotional support, Wenceslaus grew up with the intense pressure to be a great king, while absolutely no one ever taught him how to be one. This becomes very obvious after his father died. At 16, Wenceslaus inherited Bohemia plus the ever-fragile Polish crown. He celebrated the way any overwhelmed teenage monarch might, with heavy drinking, ignoring his advisors, and making extremely questionable political decisions. His idea of diplomacy usually involved insulting someone important and then forgetting he had done so. He was, in short, not ready. Let's drift gently through his royal resume. He lost Hungary. He lost most of Poland soon after inheriting it. He alienated half of Bohemia's nobility. And he accidentally triggered a few civil conflicts because he never read the paperwork people gave him. Still, he had one big plan left, a military campaign to reclaim control over Poland. It was supposed to be his big comeback arc, his serious king moment. Instead, it became a medieval cautionary tale. In 1306, he marched into Poland with a small entourage, stopped in the town of Olomouc and decided to rest, which was honestly fair. But then someone stabbed him to death in his room, and to this day nobody is totally sure who did it. There are theories, of course. Assassins hired by rival nobles, a political conspiracy, a personal revenge attack, or maybe just someone tired of his whole teenage king energy. Whatever the cause, Wenceslaus III died at 17, the last male of his dynasty, leaving behind 3 empty thrones, several confused nobles, and a historical legacy that can be summarized as, he really tried, mostly. Let's drift away from his messy, slightly tragic teenage reign and float toward another royal disaster waiting patiently across the centuries. Because next up, we're moving to a child ruler who didn't lose kingdoms. He lost something arguably worse, his grip on reality. Stay comfortable. This is a slow one. Part 5 begins, you said. Continue, ChatGPT said. Part 5. The boy who slowly slipped into his own mind, Charles VI of France. Hey guys, welcome back. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfect. Because this next royal child we're drifting toward lived a life that feels like watching a candle slowly melt sideways. Soft, sad, strangely calming, and very, very medieval. Tonight we float over to Charles VI of France, also known much later as Charles the Mad. But don't worry, we're not diving into chaos or horror. We're staying in that relaxed, slightly melancholic space where history feels more like a fading dream than a story. So go ahead, sink a little deeper, take a slow breath. And let's wander back to late 14th century France, where a 10-year-old boy suddenly became king, and no one had the faintest clue how fragile he really was. Charles VI was born in 1368, the son of Charles V, a king who was smart, competent, and unfortunately very mortal. When Charles V died, little Charles VI, only 10 years old, found himself crowned king of a country knee-deep in the 100 Years, war, political corruption, peasant rebellions, and the occasional financial meltdown. You know, the usual. A child king meant one thing, regents. A whole committee of uncles, and these uncles were the type of relatives who show up uninvited, eat all your food, and then insist they're doing you a favor. There was Uncle Valois, who loved power a little too much. Uncle Barry, who treated the royal treasury like a personal allowance. Uncle Burgundy, who basically acted like the kingdom was a long-term airbnb he could redecorate at will. Little Charles mostly watched from a cushioned throne while these grown men argued over who got to sign which royal document. But everyone agreed on one thing. Charles was sweet, gentle, sensitive, a little too soft for the medieval political shark tank. When he officially took power in his early teens, people actually celebrated. He was calm, he listened, he cared. France thought, finally, a king who won't scream at us, tax us to death, or declare war during breakfast. For a brief, peaceful moment, Charles VI was called Charles the Beloved. But you know how medieval genetics tend to behave. Let's just say his family tree didn't exactly branch out. By his early 20s, after years of stress, overwork, and being surrounded by advisors who made terrible decisions, Charles began showing small signs that something was aligned. He'd get headaches that lasted days. He'd forget important names. He'd stare into corners as if something was quietly whispering there. Medieval doctors helpfully suggested the usual treatments: bleeding him, purging him, making him drink warm wine infused with suspicious herbs. Basically anything except actual medicine. Then came the moment people remember, A hot summer day in 1392 when Charles had a sudden breakdown during a campaign. One minute he was riding with his knights, slightly sweaty but fine. The next, he drew his sword and attacked his own men, convinced they were enemies hiding in plain sight. When he was finally restrained, he fell into a trance. And just like that, the king was no longer entirely present. This was the beginning of decades. Yes, decades of Charles slipping gently in and out of reality. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly dissolving like fog thinning at sunrise. He would sometimes forget who he was. He would forget being king. He would call his wife that woman who lives in the palace, which I'm sure was a fun marriage moment. He once believed he was made of glass, and if anyone touched him, he would shatter. So he wrapped himself in blankets, avoided sudden movements, and demanded iron rods be sewn into his clothes for support. Honestly, same. There were long, calm periods when he seemed almost normal again. He'd smile softly. He'd hold council meetings. He'd listen to music. People called these the lucid seasons, as if he were a weather pattern drifting through the palace. Then the confusion would settle back in, slow and heavy, and the court would lower its voice again. His uncles returned. His in-laws grabbed power. His advisors feuded constantly. France basically became a political daycare full of adults who should not have been left unsupervised. And through it all, Charles just existed, gentle, lost. A king who tried, but whose mind kept wandering somewhere just out of reach. He died at 43, worn down, tired, and surrounded by a court that spent more time plotting than comforting. By then, France was fractured, exhausted, and on the verge of letting England take over entirely. But when historians look back, they often pause at Charles VI. Not because he was dangerous like a warrior king, but because he was dangerous in a very medieval way. A king who couldn't rule left a kingdom that ruled itself apart. Take a slow breath. Let's drift onward. Because our next child monarch didn't just lose control. He grew up surrounded by so much manipulation, backstabbing, and emotional chaos that it basically shaped his entire personality. Part 6. The prince raised by hostages, traitors, and extremely bad role models. James II of Scotland, hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, still awake, or pleasantly not awake, let's drift into another royal childhood that felt less like a life and more like a long, quiet political hostage situation. Tonight we're floating north into medieval Scotland. Cold stone walls, long winters, very dramatic politics spoken in very calm tones. A perfect setting for bedtime history. Our next child monarch is James II of Scotland, a boy who became king at 6, and then spent the rest of his childhood quietly watching grown men use his kingdom like a personal wrestling arena. Get comfortable. This one has the emotional energy of a slow-moving rain cloud. James II was born in 1430 in Edinburgh Castle, which, on a good day, felt like a drafty medieval refrigerator. He was the second son of King James I, a ruler who was smart, harsh, slightly paranoid, and unfortunately assassinated when James II was only 6 years old. Now, losing a parent is tragic. Losing a king is political chaos. But losing a king who left behind a 6-year-old heir. That's basically medieval code for, congrats everyone, it's now open season for noble families who love power a little too much. So little James was crowned, dressed in royal robes that were probably too heavy for him, and quickly surrounded by adults who claimed they were protecting him, while mostly protecting their own future tax privileges. The main players were the Douglas family, a dynasty so powerful that people whispered they could replace the king with a large, well-trained horse and still run the country effectively. They acted as James's protectors, advisors, babysitters, and unofficially his prison wardens, because James spent most of his childhood not ruling, not playing, and not doing anything remotely childlike. Instead, he was moved from castle to castle for his safety, which is medieval noble code for, we want to keep the king where we can see him. Imagine being 7 and realizing everyone around you is smiling politely while deciding the fate of your kingdom without including you in the group chat. But James was observant, quiet, a little intense. Even as a child, he watched everything. And he developed one very reasonable fear. He did not trust the Douglas family. Probably because the Douglases frequently behaved like a political tornado, sucking up power, money, land, and occasionally each other. By the time James reached his early teens, things were getting worse. Rival noble factions started fighting over custody of the king, not metaphorically, literally. Groups of armored men would show up, grab James, and claim they were now in charge of supervising him. So childhood became a series of polite kidnappings. All while James sat quietly in a corner, probably thinking, being king is exhausting, and I haven't even done anything yet. When he was about 14, everything escalated. William Douglas, the young Earl of Douglas, grew so powerful that he basically acted like a shadow king. He had armies, alliances, admirers, which is not a comforting vibe when you're the actual king and barely old enough to shave. James reached a breaking point. He wanted independence. He wanted control. He wanted to be something more than the kingdom's most valuable piece of political furniture. But he waited and watched and grew older. By 16, he was ready to reclaim power in a very calm, very medieval way. He invited William Douglas to a small dinner meeting at Stirling Castle, just a tiny, simple chat. Nothing dramatic, soft candlelight, quiet voices, very chill. Halfway through the conversation, James calmly pointed out that Douglas had been making alliances behind his back. Alliances strong enough to overthrow a king. Douglas shrugged, probably in the aristocratic tone of, yeah, and James, finally done with this decade-long political babysitting cycle, ordered him killed on the spot, which, medieval ethics aside, was surprisingly decisive for a teenager who spent his whole childhood being moved around like luggage. This moment snapped something into place. James II wasn't going to be the quiet, passive child king anymore. He stepped into power like someone who had waited years for this exact breath. He pushed back against the Douglas family. He stabilized the crown. He actually tried to rule. And for a while, things were better. But because medieval royalty never gets a peaceful ending, James eventually developed one very dangerous hobby. He loved cannons. Loved them in a way that was almost adorable if it weren't for the consequences. Collected them, named them, showed them off to ambassadors, and took them into battle like oversized metal pets. And during a siege in 1460, at age 30, one of his beloved cannons exploded near him. He died instantly. There's something strangely poetic about it. A child king raised in chaos who fought for control his whole life, finally undone by one of the only things he genuinely loved. Quiet, sudden, a spark in the dark. Let's ease out of Scotland now. Loosen your shoulders. Maybe take a slow sip of water if you're still awake enough to do that. Because next, we're drifting toward a child monarch whose life was less dramatic, less violent, and more like watching a long, sad royal identity crisis. A boy born to be king, but treated more like a decorative symbol than a person. Part 7. The child who became a crown before he became a person, Puyi, the last emperor of China. Hey guys, welcome back. If your breathing has slowed, and the room feels a little heavier, that's perfect. This next story is one of the gentlest and saddest cases of a child monarch who ruled an empire he barely understood, in a palace he wasn't allowed to leave, surrounded by adults who treated him more like a ceremonial object than an actual human being. Tonight, we're drifting into early 20th century China, to the quiet, echoing hallways of the Forbidden City, where a toddler named Aizen Jioro Puyi became emperor long before he learned how to walk properly. This one is soft, lonely, and slow like a life told through half-remembered dreams. Make yourself comfortable. We're entering a childhood sealed behind red walls and silent courtyards. Puyi was born in 1906 into the crumbling twilight of the Qing dynasty. Not a powerful era, not a stable era, just the lingering afterglow of a once massive empire trying to avoid falling apart. So naturally, when the reigning emperor died without an heir, the court looked at this very tiny, very confused 2-year-old child and said, "Yes, this baby will fix everything." And just like that, Puyi was carried, literally carried into the Forbidden City, placed on the dragon throne and crowned emperor of China at age 2. His coronation was so surreal that even his own memories later blurred together. He recalled crying loud enough to echo off the palace walls while the Empress Dowager soothed him in that soft, tired way that adults use when they're comforting a child for political reasons. Picture a toddler whose feet don't reach the floor, wrapped in heavy imperial robes, surrounded by bowing officials who are terrified of angering him, even though he can barely pronounce the word milk yet. That was Puyi's life. But here's the strange part. He wasn't raised like a king. He was raised like a museum artifact. His days were tightly controlled. He couldn't leave the palace. He couldn't play in the street. He couldn't talk to most of the servants. And he couldn't, under any circumstances, make decisions. Because the adults around him, regents, eunuchs, tutors, dowager empresses, were far too busy making decisions for him. He had absolute power on paper and zero power in reality. That kind of contradiction does something to a child's mind, something quiet, something hard to explain. Puyi later described his childhood in the Forbidden City as feeling like being locked inside a very beautiful box. Gold-rimmed, silk-lined, but still a box. He had toys, but no playmates. He had servants, but no friends. He had a throne, but no choices. Even his food was inspected so many times that it reached him cold and tasteless. The adults around him bowed deeply, called him Your Majesty, and then immediately ignored every word he said because, technically, he wasn't in charge. Imagine being 4 years old, asking for a glass of water, and watching 6 grown men scramble to interpret whether this was a divine command, a political signal, or a random toddler statement of mild thirst. Puyi grew up with a very interesting understanding of reality. When he was 6, he ordered his English tutor to be fired for giving him homework. When he was 7, he told a servant to beat another servant for making noise during his nap. And the court obeyed. Because that's what you do when a child god lives in your hallway. But outside those walls, China was changing fast. Revolutions, protests, a new government forming just beyond the palace gates. In 1912, when Puyi was still a small, wide-eyed 6-year-old, he was quietly informed that he was no longer emperor. Just like that. A ceremony, a document, a political sigh, but they didn't tell him what it meant. So little Puyi kept wearing his imperial robes, kept giving imperial commands, and kept being treated like an emperor by the palace staff, even though the country no longer recognized his title. He was a child living inside a political illusion. Too young to understand it, too isolated to question it. For years, he wandered the Forbidden City like a ghost in embroidered robes, technically dethroned, yet still obeyed. He once asked why cannons weren't firing on his birthday anymore. The servants gave him vague excuses, because no one wanted to be the person who explained reality to the child who used to rule China. It's one of the gentlest tragedies in history. Not violent, not explosive, just quietly heartbreaking. Eventually, in 1924, the government finally expelled him from the palace. He left the Forbidden City at 18, his first time experiencing the outside world. Imagine stepping outside your home for the first time in your entire life, hearing car horns, seeing crowds, feeling cold air without permission. He later wrote that it felt like waking up from a dream and realizing the dream had been his entire identity. Let's drift away from the red walls now, slowly, gently. Because our next child ruler isn't surrounded by servants or palaces. He's surrounded by suspicion, whispers, and the very uncomfortable reality of being a child king in a world where kings didn't live very long. We're moving to ancient Egypt next, to a boy whose name everyone knows, but whose life was far quieter, sadder, and more controlled than the golden mask suggests. Part 8. The boy whose name outlived his life, Tutankhamun of Egypt. Hey guys, welcome back. If the room feels still and your mind feels a little floaty, that's perfect. Because this next child ruler is someone you've definitely heard of, probably from documentaries, museum posters, or that one friend who went through an ancient Egypt phase in middle school. But the real story of Tutankhamun isn't glamorous, isn't adventurous, isn't even particularly dramatic. It's quiet, sad, and strangely small for a boy whose funerary mask became a global icon. So let's sink into this one like soft sand, drift back more than 3,000 years, and step into a world of sun-bleached temples, incense smoke, and a little boy who never planned to be king, and probably never wanted to be. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 BCE during a very weird moment in Egyptian history. The reign of Akhenaten, the pharaoh famous for attempting the first major monotheistic religion. And by attempting, I mean he basically said, "We will now worship only one God, it's the sun, everyone deal with it." The entire kingdom was confused, the priesthood was offended, the economy was spiraling, and little Tutankhamun was born into this religious chaos like a baby brought home during a house fire. Now, Tutankhamun was almost certainly the son of Akhenaten, which means he inherited all the genetic perks of Egyptian royal inbreeding. And yes, those perks were exactly as fun as they sound. He was frail, sickly, thin, and his bones never fully developed the way they were supposed to. Walking hurt, standing hurt, living hurt. Some days he needed a cane, other days he needed several. And at 8 or 9 years old, when he was still very much a child, he was placed on the throne and declared Pharaoh of Egypt, the living embodiment of a god. Imagine being that young, struggling to walk without assistance, and suddenly everyone starts bowing, chanting hymns, and calling you the earthly manifestation of divine power. It wasn't empowering, it was overwhelming. Tutankhamun didn't rule anything. The adults around him did. Two men took total control of his life. I, the political mastermind. Hormheb, the military powerhouse. These two quietly ran the government while putting the child pharaoh forward like a ceremonial puppet. If there was ever a decision that mattered, taxes, temples, foreign policy, it came from I or Hormheb. Tutankhamun signed things. He smiled in ceremonies. He appeared in parades, but he wasn't steering anything. And honestly, he wasn't healthy enough to. His childhood was spent indoors, sitting on cushions, wrapped in linen, treated carefully so he wouldn't break another bone. He had tutors reading to him, priestesses chanting around him, and doctors applying ointments while whispering prayers that must have sounded more desperate than reverent. He didn't get to run, or explore, or laugh the way children are supposed to. His body simply couldn't keep up. By the time he turned 10 or so, I and Hormheb made a major decision on his behalf. They reversed Akhenaten's religious reforms, all of them. The temples reopened. The priests cheered. The sun god monopoly quietly ended. Tutankhamun's name was even changed from Tutankhaten, living image of the Ot, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amen, a political rebrand, ancient Egypt edition. Meanwhile, the boy himself was just trying his best to stay alive. His letters mentioned pain, limping, fatigue, frequent fevers. His tutors tried to teach him royal duties. His wife, Ankhesenamun, who was also his half-sister, tried to comfort him. But he lived in a world where everyone expected him to act like a god while his body was barely holding him together. He died around age 19, barely an adult, barely a king, and certainly not the powerful figure modern pop culture makes him out to be. What happened after his death is almost comically on brand. I became pharaoh for a bit. Hormheb became pharaoh after that. And both of them made sure to erase Tutankhamun's name from official history so they could rewrite the story in their own favor. Tutankhamun wasn't remembered as a great king. He wasn't remembered as anything. He was quietly buried in a smaller tomb, probably a rushed choice, and left to be forgotten. And that's exactly what happened for more than 3,000 years, until his tomb happened to be the only one in the Valley of the Kings that grave robbers didn't manage to empty. So the unhealthiest boy pharaoh in Egyptian history ended up becoming the most famous one, not because of his life, not because of his reign, but because archaeologists got very lucky in 1922. His golden mask, still shining after thousands of years, did what he never could in life. It made him immortal. Let's breathe out here. Soft inhale, slow exhale. Because we're drifting next into one of the strangest royal childhoods in European history. A child king raised by tutors who argued all the time, nobles who plotted all the time, and a country that kept expecting him to be an adult long before he was ready. It's a quiet one, a lonely one, a very English 1 part 10, continuing the full 1.5-hour script all right. Let's just ease back into the dimly lit corridor of history. We're still drifting through the strange little world of child monarchs, tiny rulers with oversized crowns and even bigger political problems. And yes, somehow there are still more of them, because medieval Europe never seemed to run out of infants to put on thrones. So let's float to another royal nursery that doubled as a war room. The infant who became a king. Against everyone's better judgment, King Henry VI of England crowned at 8 months old. If there was ever a child who should not have been put in charge of anything, even a wooden spoon, it was Henry VI. He entered the world in 1421 as the only son of Henry V, England's mighty warrior king, the medieval equivalent of a celebrity child. By the time baby Henry turned 9 months, he had already inherited a kingdom actively at war, because of course he did. In a very technical, very bureaucratic, very medieval sense, Henry became king of 2 kingdoms at once, England and France, thanks to the Treaty of Troyes. England celebrated, France cried, and little Henry sat there chewing on his own fingers because he literally had no clue. People would later call him gentle, devout, and painfully soft-hearted, which fine, nice qualities for a monk. Much less ideal for a man expected to command armies and manage nobles with the temperament of caffeinated rhinos. But let's start slowly, because that's the bedtime vibe. Henry's early years were exactly what you'd expect from someone raised to be king before he knew how to sit up straight. Every tutor, every guardian, every courtier treated him like the second coming of his father, a father who had been tall, strong, charismatic, and terrifyingly efficient at conquest. Henry, Not so much. From the beginning, people noticed he had a quiet, dreamy voice, the kind that sounded like he'd apologize to a door for bumping into it. He prayed more than he spoke. He avoided conflict the way cats avoid bathwater. And he had absolutely zero sense for political manipulation, which is a real problem when your nobles are constantly plotting at the speed of light. But the kingdom waited patiently. Surely he'd grow into the role, right? He did not. Let's drift to the moment he took full power around age 16. This was the era of young teenage king trying to make big, confident decisions, which is always a questionable spectacle. Henry tried to negotiate peace with France, but in the sweetest possible way, the diplomatic equivalent of handing your enemy a blanket and saying, "Please don't be mad." The nobles were not impressed. Then came the real problem, Henry's increasing, let's say, fragility. Modern historians believe he suffered some type of mental illness, possibly hereditary, because when your grandfather is Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, your gene pool is basically a medieval roulette wheel. Henry's own breakdown struck in his early 30s, but its roots were visible early. As a teen, he froze during arguments, faded out of conversations, and became overwhelmed by stress that other monarchs shrugged off. Being king was simply not his thing, which would have been totally fine if he'd been, say, a librarian. But instead, he ruled England. The result? The Wars of the Roses, possibly the most exhausting family feud in European history. And it all spiraled from England's collective realization that their king was not exactly steering the ship. Picture this, armies mobilizing, banners flying, nobles shouting threats, and Henry sitting in the center of it like a confused church mouse wondering why everyone couldn't just share the throne and be friends. By the time Henry reached adulthood, it was clear England needed someone stronger. Enter the Duke of York, the man who basically said, "All right, if the king won't rule, I will." Cue decades of dynastic chaos. Henry became the monarch equivalent of a feather in a hurricane. He was deposed, restored, deposed again, used as a political puppet, paraded around, locked up, and eventually died under mysterious circumstances that historians politely describe as suspicious. Henry VI remains one of the softest souls ever forced into one of the harshest jobs. A child king who grew into an adult who just didn't want to be king at all. Let's drift to another child on a throne. This one who shocked everyone by turning into the exact opposite type of ruler. The prince who was too perfect to be true Emperor Franz Joseph, briefly a child ruler in waiting, ascended politically at age 5. Okay, so Franz Joseph wasn't crowned emperor at 5, but he was officially declared the heir to the Habsburg Empire at that age, which came with almost identical pressure. Imagine being 5 years old and people are already telling you your destiny is to run a multinational empire that barely functions even with adults in charge. The Habsburg court took one look at Franz Joseph and said, "Yes, this one, let's traumatize him early." From the moment he could walk, he was drilled with military training, languages, etiquette, and the kind of posture discipline that would make modern chiropractors weep. His relatives barely let him play. They believed too much childhood joy produced weak rulers. Classic Habsburg optimism. Franz Joseph grew up fast, too fast. By 13, his schedule looked like a small, rigidly structured torture device. By 16, he already had the emotional range of a granite countertop. So when he finally became emperor at 18, he seemed ready. Calm, poised, almost unnervingly stoic. The perfect young monarch, except no. Underneath the polished surface was a kid who'd never been allowed to be a kid. Someone who internalized pressure like a sponge, and refused to break outwardly even when his entire empire was breaking around him. What followed were decades of personal tragedies, a strict and unhappy marriage, rebellions, assassinations, and the slow, painful decay of the Habsburg realm. Franz Joseph handled it all with the same quiet, exhausted determination of a student who has accepted their fate during exam season. Unlike Henry VI, Franz Joseph didn't collapse. He just endured for 68 long years. But he's not our last child ruler tonight. History had plenty more tiny monarchs to offer. Let's drift to another royal nursery. The little king with the biggest crown in Asia, Puyi, the last emperor of China, crowned at 2 years old. If you ever want a perfect example of a child placed in an impossible role, Puyi is your guy. He was two, still learning how to coordinate his limbs. Still at the stage where dropping a spoon is comedy gold. And that's when the Qing court came marching in to announce that, congratulations, he was now the son of heaven, ruler of one of the largest civilizations on earth. The ceremony to enthrone him was intense. Puyi later recalled that he cried through most of it, which honestly feels like the only reasonable reaction. Imagine being lifted onto a throne while 100 adults bow, thousands watch, and you're not even potty trained. From that moment, his life became a curated cage. No friends, no freedom, no normal childhood. Everything was ritual and protocol, and every adult around him treated him like a fragile deity who might break if he smiled too hard. The problem? China was collapsing. The Qing dynasty was barely holding on, and putting a toddler on the throne didn't exactly help consumer confidence. Within just a few years, Puyi was emperor in name only. He grew up inside the Forbidden City like a ghost child, present but powerless. After the revolution, he lived in the palace as a retired emperor at the age of 6, which has to be the strangest retirement plan in history. Later, warlords, foreign powers, and political factions all tried to use him. He was manipulated, dragged into puppet governments, imprisoned, and re-educated. His life was one long chain of adults deciding things for him, a leftover monarch in a world that had no use for monarchs anymore. Puyi wasn't dangerous, but the world around him was, and that makes his childhood reign one of the most fragile and sad chapters in monarchical history. Let's float again because we still have one more ruler tonight. The boy who invented a national crisis by existing King Sobhuza II of Swaziland, crowned at 4 months old, yes, months. If coronations had a minimum age requirement, medieval and early modern societies absolutely ignored it. Sobhuza II became king before he could roll over. Born in 1899, he became ruler when his father died unexpectedly. His grandmother, the formidable Labitsibni, took over as regent, and she absolutely ran the kingdom like a seasoned political queen while little Sobhuza sat in his baby hut, doing normal baby things. The funny part. Nobody really expected him to be extraordinary, but he was. Sobhuza grew into one of the most stable, longest-reigning monarchs in world history, ruling for 82 years, outlasting wars, colonial administrations, independence, and political turmoil. Yet his early life was a parade of adults arguing about which clan was going to control him. Traditionalists, colonial officials, royal relatives, everyone wanted a piece of the baby king. It was like the royal version of a custody battle, except the child involved technically owned a whole country. The real twist is that Sobhuza adapted. He watched, he learned, he waited. When he finally took full power, he ruled with a uniquely calm, methodical confidence. Not flashy, not loud, just stable. A rare happy ending in the world of child monarchs. If you're still awake, you're doing great. If you're drifting off, that's kind of the point. Part 11, continuing the 1.5-hour sleepy history script, all right. Let's settle back in. If your blankets are cozy and your eyes are getting heavier, you're exactly where this story wants you to be. We're just going to let the night keep rolling as we drift into yet another corner of history where small children wore crowns far too big for their heads. Tonight, we're gliding toward one of the oldest child ruler traditions in the world, a place where being king as a little kid wasn't just an accident of dynastic chaos. It was practically a system. The boy pharaohs of ancient Egypt, because nothing says, relax before bed, quite like a civilization that crowned toddlers. Egypt loved child rulers, loved them. The Nile Valley had this deep belief that kingship was divine, passed down from one body to the next like a cosmic baton. So if the king died and his heir was 6 years old, no problem. The gods would sort it out. One of the most famous examples, of course, is King Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb became more famous than his actual life. But Tut is just one name in a long list of Egyptian rulers who probably spent more time chasing dung beetles around the courtyard than reading state documents. Let's ease into the world of Tutankhamun, or Tut, because we're not formal here. Tutankhamun crowned at around 8 or 9, Tut wasn't supposed to be king. He was the spare child in a very messy post-Amarna palace drama. His father, or possibly his uncle, the family tree is a little Habsburg-flavored, left Egypt in chaos after trying to overthrow centuries of religious tradition. So the court basically looked around and said, let's just put this kid on the throne and undo everything. Nobody fight about it. Tut's childhood was not great. Archaeology shows he had a clubbed foot, spinal issues, and fragile bones, probably thanks to the royal family's enthusiastic habit of marrying their own siblings. Kind of a theme tonight. His tutors probably spent more time helping him walk than teaching him statecraft. But here's the thing, Tut didn't rule. Not really. Adults ruled for him: priests, generals, advisors, everyone who had an agenda. Tut signed things, blessed rituals, and occasionally said something kingly before being ushered back to his room so the grown-ups could actually run Egypt. That said, he did reverse his predecessor's religious revolution and restore old temples. Not because he was a visionary 8-year-old, more likely because every adult around him agreed it needed to be done, and Tut was the easiest signature to obtain. He died at about 18. Young, thin, probably exhausted from a life that demanded too much from a body dealing with chronic pain. But the calm part? His reign was one of the gentlest Egypt ever experienced. No coups, no wars, just quiet restoration. A rare moment of peace, delivered by a boy who barely had time to understand what ruling even meant. Let's drift onward, because Tut was Egypt's only miniature monarch. Pii, the longest childhood reign in history crowned at. 6 years old ruled for, about 90 years, yes. 90. Pepi became king so young that some historians believe he still had baby teeth. The old kingdom was already fraying around the edges, and the death of his father left Pepi as the only viable heir. So, classic history move, the court put a 6-year-old on the throne and hoped for the best. Pepi's early childhood was spent surrounded by older officials who practically controlled his entire world. He issued decrees through scribes, played in palace courtyards, and occasionally got carried around like a ceremonial doll for public appearances. One story says he loved animals so much that he kept pets everywhere, including a favorite pygmy dancer brought from deep Africa to entertain him. Pepi was delighted. Egyptian officials were less delighted because organizing expeditions to fetch rare animals for a tiny emperor is something only a child would demand and only ancient bureaucracy would attempt. As Pepi grew older, his ruling style stayed oddly childlike. Not in a bad way, just gentle, patient, slightly detached. He didn't wage huge wars. He didn't purge his court. He didn't terrorize officials the way some pharaohs enjoyed doing before breakfast. But here's the ironic twist. The longer he ruled, the weaker the kingdom grew. Decades passed. Governors gained power. Bureaucracies drifted out of sync. And Pepi, old, frail, and probably tired of being king for literally his entire life, remained on the throne while Egypt gradually slid into chaos. His reign eventually ended in collapse. But through it all, Pepi remained this oddly serene, unbothered figure, a king who outlived almost everyone who had ever advised him. A child king who died an old man without ever really knowing a life outside of being pharaoh. Let's keep drifting gently down the Nile, but also away from it, because our next ruler is from a much more stormy landscape. The child king who insisted on being scary Ivan IV of Russia, Ivan the Terrible, crowned at 3 years old. Yes, he was terrible. No, not because he was 3, although being 3 surely didn't help. Ivan IV entered the world in 1530, and by 1533, he was already technically the Grand Prince of Moscow. A toddler, with a title, and an entire aristocracy ready to use him as their golden puppet. His childhood was so dysfunctional that it feels like the origin story of a villain in a very slow, very sad bedtime movie. After his father died, his mother tried to rule as regent, but died mysteriously when Ivan was 8. Most historians believe she was poisoned because Muscovite politics were basically a full-time murder hobby. From then on, life turned into a royal horror daycare. The boy was neglected, abused, and ignored. Tutors came and went. Servants mistreated him. The aristocratic clans used him as a ceremonial prop while they fought over power, land, and whose mustache was superior. You'd think someone might check on the emotional well-being of the child king. But no, this was Russia. 16th century Russia. Ivan responded the only way a traumatized child with absolute authority possibly could, by becoming increasingly withdrawn, then increasingly vengeful. One of his earliest acts of power as a teenager was to throw aristocrats' pets off balconies. Symbolic, cruel, and definitely the result of someone who had never known stability in his entire life. When Ivan finally took the throne formally, the first Russian ruler to style himself Tsar, the nobles cheered. They thought they had groomed a pliable, fearful young man who would depend on them. They were wrong. Ivan grew into a ruler who trusted no one, forgave nothing, and remembered every slight committed against him as a child. His paranoia became a political tool. His sadness became policy, and his rage became legendary. But we're not here to recount his violent acts. This script isn't about shock or horror. Instead, the calm takeaway is this. Ivan IV was a child forced to rule before he even knew what ruling meant. And every tragedy that followed was the echo of those early years. Let's drift away from Russia now. Something a little gentler awaits. The child king who just wanted to read BOOKS Charles VII of France crowned at 13 years old. Charles VII is sort of the opposite of Ivan. If Ivan was forged by trauma, Charles was shaped by softness and a shocking lack of supervision. Charles became king as a teen in the late 15th century. France was still recovering from the 100 Years' War, and what the kingdom really needed was a stable, level-headed adult on the throne. Instead, they got Charles. Charles wasn't violent. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even particularly ambitious. He was sweet, slightly awkward, possibly a bit sheltered, with a face described by contemporaries as pleasant but not very kingly. He loved reading stories of knights, chivalry, quests, basically medieval fantasy novels before fantasy novels existed. So when he came of age and finally had full control, Charles made a single catastrophic decision. He tried to live his favorite stories in real life. Specifically, he launched an unnecessary, expensive, and extremely chaotic invasion of Italy, purely because he thought it would make him look like a heroic knight destined for glory. It did not. The whole thing was a diplomatic and military mess. France won battles, lost allies, hemorrhaged money, and Charles nearly died multiple times from basic logistical disasters like entering a city too quickly and tripping. I'm serious. He actually died later in life from walking into a low doorway. Charles VII remains the best example of what happens when a bookish child king grows up still thinking he's starring in a bedtime adventure story. Sweet, soft, a little misguided. But not dangerous, just overly enthusiastic in the most gentle way. Part 12. Continuing the 1.5-hour sleepy history script, all right? Let's just let the room get quiet again. Slow breath in, slow breath out. And we'll keep wandering through this gentle landscape of tiny rulers who somehow ended up steering entire kingdoms before they could even tie their shoes. We're drifting now into a softer, slower stretch of history, where the crowns were heavy, the courts were dramatic, and the children wearing those crowns were often just trying their best not to panic. Let's glide into one of the most famous royal childhoods in British history. The little princess who never expected to be Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom became heir at. Just a baby became queen at. 18 now, Victoria was not technically a child monarch. When she took the throne, she waited just long enough to legally be considered an adult. But her entire path to the crown was shaped by a childhood so tightly controlled that she might as well have been preparing to rule from the moment she learned to walk. And she really did grow up under what we might call intense supervision, the Kensington system. It sounds like a fitness routine. It was not. It was a handcrafted, hyper-restrictive, deeply exhausting set of rules designed by her mother and her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy, to keep Victoria isolated, obedient, and malleable. The girl couldn't walk down a hall without holding someone's hand. She wasn't allowed to sleep without her mother in the same room. She couldn't play with other children. She wasn't even allowed to see certain parts of Kensington Palace. It was like being raised in a royal snow globe, beautiful, fragile, sealed. Victoria's life as a child was one long lesson in being watched. And the funniest part, it completely backfired. The moment she became queen at 18, she fired half the people who tried to control her, banished Conroy from her presence, and took full command of the monarchy with this calm, steely determination that shocked everyone who'd expected a timid little puppet. Vengeance? No, just a quiet, decisive no thank you. We're done here. Her childhood didn't break her. It tempered her. It's a nice change of pace from the chaos we've been visiting. A child raised under pressure, who grew into someone remarkably stable. Let's stroll gently onward. The king who lost his mother and his kingdom at the same time, John I of France, the posthumous, reigned, 5 days age. 0 John I technically counts as a child monarch. A very tiny one. He never cried publicly, never issued a decree, never sat through a council meeting, never wore the crown for more than a few ceremonial minutes. Why? Because he wasn't alive long enough. John was born in 1316. His father, Louis X, died before he was born, leaving France in a very awkward situation. The next ruler was currently still inside his mother. So they waited and waited. And when John was finally born, the entire kingdom erupted in celebration. A boy, a king, a legitimate heir. He became king the moment he took his first breath. And then 5 days later, he died. A monarch whose reign lasted exactly the length of a long nap. Some whispered poisoning, others whispered curses, and a lot of people whispered about which noble benefited from his death, because medieval Europe loved conspiracy theories even more than modern YouTube commenters. But the peaceful version, the bedtime-friendly version, is simply that he was a fragile newborn in a fragile age. He's still remembered as France's briefest king. A reminder that some royal stories are small, quiet, and over almost as soon as they begin. Let's drift to someone who at least made it past infancy. The child who became emperor by accident, Go-Mizunoo, emperor of Japan, crowned at 5 years old in Japan's imperial tradition. Crowning children wasn't unusual. The emperor was more spiritual symbol than political general, especially by the early 1600s. Real power sat with the shogunate, while the emperor lived in a serene bubble of ceremony, poetry, and courtly duties. Go-Mizunoo was born into that system, a palace raised on lacquer, silk, incense, and formality. He became emperor at age 5, which meant his childhood was mostly one long performance of sacred rites he didn't yet understand. His adult life was quiet, calm, and dominated by aesthetics, poetry readings, calligraphy practice, seasonal rituals, contemplating the moon, the classic imperial childhood package. What made his reign interesting, in the softest possible way, is that he was one of the last emperors before a long stretch of abdications. By tradition, emperors often stepped down voluntarily so their successors could rule symbolically while they themselves retired into monastic life. And Go-Mizunoo did exactly that. He abdicated in favor of his young daughter, Princess Meisho, who was also a child when she took the throne, and then spent decades living peacefully as a retired emperor, studying tea ceremony and painting. Imagine being crowned at 5 and retiring to a peaceful artistic life before age 40. Not a bad arc, honestly. Let's drift farther east for one final monarch in this part. The boy who ruled a nomadic empire, Yesun Temur Khan, Yuan dynasty, crowned at around 13 now. This one's a calmer chapter in the otherwise not-so-calm history of the Mongol Empire. By the time Yesun Temur came along, the dynasty was splintered, tired, and weighed down by the administrative complexities of ruling China. Being a teenager on that throne was like being handed the world's largest group project after the previous students already messed up the slides. Yesun Temur wasn't a warrior prodigy like some of his ancestors. He wasn't a visionary. He wasn't even particularly ambitious. He was fine, perfectly average, a B-minus monarch, which honestly was exactly what the empire needed. He focused on administrative calm. He slowed down spending. He didn't launch any wild invasions. He treated officials with courtesy. He reigned in corruption very gently, like someone trimming a bonsai tree instead of swinging an axe. Was he famous? No, legendary? Not really. Dangerous? Definitely not. He was the Mongol Empire's quiet middle chapter, an underrated reminder that teenage rulers sometimes work best when they don't try too hard. And that's where we'll pause this part of our slow drift through the world of child monarchs. Part 13. Continuing the 1.5-hour sleepy history script, here we go again. Let's let the world get heavy and quiet around us as we drift deeper into the dim backrooms of royal history. Those strange, echoing corridors where children wore crowns, regents whispered, and entire kingdoms pretended a toddler could solve adult problems. Settle in, breathe slow, and let's keep going. The child king who barely got to be a child at all, James II of Scotland, crowned at 6 years old. James II had the kind of childhood that guaranteed two things. One, he would one day be king. Two, and he would absolutely not enjoy the process of getting there. His father, James I, was assassinated when the boy was 6, leaving young James to inherit a crown that came with a long list of problems and exactly 0 instructions. That's usually how Scottish monarchy worked in the Middle Ages. A king dies violently. A child inherits. The nobility immediately starts wrestling in the background. Classic. James spent his early years surrounded by feuding nobles, rival clans, and guardians who definitely cared more about their own influence than the emotional well-being of a child who still slept with soft blankets and carved wooden toys. He was coronated in Holyrood, placed on the throne like a decorative item, and then whisked away by regents who were already plotting against one another. Childhood for James meant being relocated constantly for safety, being used as the royal prize in political tug-of-war, and occasionally watching armed nobles yell at each other in rooms he wasn't technically allowed to enter. By the time he reached his teens, James grew into a surprisingly strong ruler, but the emotional residue of his early years followed him like a shadow. He was quick-tempered, restless, and uneasy around the great noble families, and with some fairness. Since many of them had spent his childhood treating him like a chess piece, he always carried the memory of being a scared 6-year-old watching adults ruin his kingdom. James II eventually became a firm, sometimes harsh ruler, determined to put nobles back in their place. But under all that was still the little boy who had learned far too early that kingship was less about crowns and more about surviving the ambitions of grown men. Let's drift onward, a little softer now. The prince who was 4 years old and already in danger, Charles IX of France, crowned at 10 years old became heir at. Age 4 France in the mid-1500s was not the ideal place to be a child, or a teenager, or honestly, anyone. The wars of religion were simmering, royal power was shaky, and the Valois dynasty kept producing delicate, exhausted children who never seemed prepared for the chaos they inherited. Charles IX was one of them. He became heir to the throne when he was only 4, after the death of his older brother. And from that moment, his life became a ceremonial blur of tutors, etiquette, and the kind of strict supervision that turns childhood into a museum exhibit. When he became king at 10, real power fell to his formidable mother, Catherine de' Medici, who essentially ran the country while Charles tried to be calm, quiet, and obedient in the middle of a political earthquake. Charles wasn't dangerous, but the world around him absolutely was. He grew into a nervous, highly strung young man, the kind who tried to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. He wanted peace but was surrounded by men who wanted war. He wanted stability but inherited a kingdom made of fault lines. Historians often describe him with soft language, anxious, fragile, impressionable, a boy who never quite had the psychological tools for kingship. When the infamous religious violence of his reign broke out, Charles was overwhelmed. Not bloodthirsty, not cruel, just terrified. A child ruler shoved into one of Europe's most volatile political situations. His story is one of the clearest examples of how child monarchs weren't dangerous themselves. It was the adults around them who turned the crown into a weapon. Let's float somewhere gentler now, somewhere with better weather and fewer religious riots. The child who became king of Spain without wanting to, Alfonso XIII of Spain, crowned at birth. Alfonso XIII holds the unique title of being one of the few monarchs who began ruling before he technically existed outside his mother. His father died before he was born, so the moment Alfonso took his first breath in 1886, Spain already had a new, screaming baby king. His childhood was a curious blend of royal rituals, military parades, and constant national tension. Spain was struggling politically, economically, socially, and the vast colonial empire was beginning to crack around the edges. But Alfonso, he was mostly a cheerful kid. He grew up surrounded by nannies, guards, tutors, and ceremonial duties he didn't understand. Every birthday meant new uniforms, new expectations, and new political opinions being whispered about him in every cafe and newspaper. The irony? Alfonso loved being king. Not in a power-hungry way, more in the enthusiastic, slightly naive, let's try everything at once way. He adored sports, cars, social events, and giving speeches. He had the energy of someone who wanted very badly to be charismatic without the political instincts to back it up. Spain didn't exactly thrive during his reign, but Alfonso wasn't malicious. Just over-eager and underprepared, a child king who grew into an adult who still felt a little too much like a teenager trying to impress everyone. A soft monarch in a hard century. Let's drift one more time before this part ends. A quiet shift to a surprisingly calm place. The infant ruler WHOSE country never panicked. Tejo Wang Xiang, Korea, Goryeo dynasty, crowned at. About 11 years old now, Goryeo, Korea had a different vibe from our usual messy European kingdoms. Regency was more organized, court factions were less murder-obsessed, and child monarchs weren't automatically doomed. Tejo Wang Xiang came to the throne young, around 11, after a period of complicated succession politics. But Goryeo handled it gracefully. His regents didn't exploit him aggressively. His officials didn't plunge the kingdom into civil war. His childhood wasn't idyllic, but it was stable. He grew up learning Buddhist texts, statecraft, calligraphy, and diplomacy, the standard royal curriculum, but without all the panic attacks and assassination plots. When he grew older, he ruled with a steady, even temperament. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic. Just fine. A quiet king in a quiet chapter of Korean history. which makes him a perfect note to end this part on calm, balanced, and softly settling into place like a candle burning low. Part 13. Continuing the 1.5-hour sleepy history script, here we go again. Let's let the world get heavy and quiet around us as we drift deeper into the dim backrooms of royal history. Those strange, echoing corridors where children wore crowns, regents whispered, and entire kingdoms pretended a toddler could solve adult problems. Settle in. Breathe slow, and let's keep going. The child king who barely got to be a child at all, James II of Scotland, crowned at. 6 years old James II had the kind of childhood that guaranteed two things. One, he would one day be king. Two, and he would absolutely not enjoy the process of getting there. His father, James I, was assassinated when the boy was 6, leaving young James to inherit a crown that came with a long list of problems and exactly 0 instructions. That's usually how Scottish monarchy worked in the Middle Ages. A king dies violently. A child inherits. The nobility immediately starts wrestling in the background. Classic. James spent his early years surrounded by feuding nobles, rival clans, and guardians who definitely cared more about their own influence than the emotional well-being of a child who still slept with soft blankets and carved wooden toys. He was coronated in Holyrood, placed on the throne like a decorative item, and then whisked away by regents who were already plotting against one another. Childhood for James meant being relocated constantly for safety, being used as the royal prize in political tug-of-war, and occasionally watching armed nobles yell at each other in rooms he wasn't technically allowed to enter. By the time he reached his teens, James grew into a surprisingly strong ruler, but the emotional residue of his early years followed him like a shadow. He was quick-tempered, restless, and uneasy around the great noble families, and with some fairness, since many of them had spent his childhood treating him like a chess piece. He always carried the memory of being a scared 6-year-old watching adults ruin his kingdom. James II eventually became a firm, sometimes harsh ruler, determined to put nobles back in their place. But under all that was still the little boy who had learned far too early that kingship was less about crowns and more about surviving the ambitions of grown men. Let's drift onward, a little softer now. The prince who was 4 years old and already in danger, Charles IX of France, crowned at. 10 years old became heir at. Age 4 France in the mid-1500s was not the ideal place to be a child, or a teenager, or honestly, anyone. The wars of religion were simmering, royal power was shaky, and the Valois dynasty kept producing delicate, exhausted children who never seemed prepared for the chaos they inherited. Charles IX was one of them. He became heir to the throne when he was only 4, after the death of his older brother. And from that moment, his life became a ceremonial blur of tutors, etiquette, and the kind of strict supervision that turns childhood into a museum exhibit. When he became king at 10, real power fell to his formidable mother, Catherine de' Medici, who essentially ran the country while Charles tried to be calm, quiet, and obedient in the middle of a political earthquake. Charles wasn't dangerous. But the world around him absolutely was. He grew into a nervous, highly strung young man, the kind who tried to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. He wanted peace but was surrounded by men who wanted war. He wanted stability but inherited a kingdom made of fault lines. Historians often describe him with soft language, anxious, fragile, impressionable, a boy who never quite had the psychological tools for kingship. When the infamous religious violence of his reign broke out, Charles was overwhelmed, not bloodthirsty, not cruel, just terrified. A child ruler shoved into one of Europe's most volatile political situations. His story is one of the clearest examples of how child monarchs weren't dangerous themselves. It was the adults around them who turned the crown into a weapon. Let's float somewhere gentler now, somewhere with better weather and fewer religious riots. The child who became king of Spain without wanting to, Alfonso XIII of Spain, crowned at. Birth Alfonso XIII holds the unique title of being one of the few monarchs who began ruling before he technically existed outside his mother. His father died before he was born, so the moment Alfonso took his first breath in 1886, Spain already had a new, screaming baby king. His childhood was a curious blend of royal rituals, military parades, and constant national tension. Spain was struggling politically, economically, socially, and the vast colonial empire was beginning to crack around the edges. But Alfonso, he was mostly a cheerful kid. He grew up surrounded by nannies, guards, tutors, and ceremonial duties he didn't understand. Every birthday meant new uniforms, new expectations, and new political opinions being whispered about him in every cafe and newspaper. The irony? Alfonso loved being king. Not in a power-hungry way, more in the enthusiastic, slightly naive. Let's try everything at once way. He adored sports, cars, social events, and giving speeches. He had the energy of someone who wanted very badly to be charismatic without the political instincts to back it up. Spain didn't exactly thrive during his reign, but Alfonso wasn't malicious. Just over-eager and underprepared, a child king who grew into an adult who still felt a little too much like a teenager trying to impress everyone. A soft monarch in a hard century. Let's drift one more time before this part ends. A quiet shift to a surprisingly calm place. The infant ruler WHOSE country never panicked. Teja Wang Xiang, Korea, Goryeo dynasty, crowned at. About 11 years old now, Goryeo, Korea had a different vibe from our usual messy European kingdoms. Regency was more organized, court factions were less murder-obsessed, and child monarchs weren't automatically doomed. Teja Wang Xiang came to the throne young, around 11, after a period of complicated succession politics. But Goryeo handled it gracefully. His regents didn't exploit him aggressively. His officials didn't plunge the kingdom into civil war. His childhood wasn't idyllic, but it was stable. He grew up learning Buddhist texts, statecraft, calligraphy, and diplomacy, the standard royal curriculum, but without all the panic attacks and assassination plots. When he grew older, he ruled with a steady, even temperament. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic. Just fine. A quiet king in a quiet chapter of Korean history. Which makes him a perfect note to end this part on: calm, balanced, and softly settling into place like a candle burning low. Part 10. Continuing, let's drift back into the candlelit haze of medieval childhood, where power was basically a game of who can reach the throne without accidentally falling off a balcony first. And tonight, we're floating over to yet another royal child who probably should have been doing homework, not running a kingdom. So, let's glide over to Ivan VI of Russia, a baby who technically ruled an empire before he was old enough to hold his own head up straight. Now, Ivan VI doesn't get much attention in modern history classes, mostly because his entire reign lasted about as long as a mildly disappointing nap. He was crowned as an infant in 1740, and yes, crowned is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Because the crown was basically being balanced on the head of a baby who probably had no idea what day it was. You wouldn't think an infant could cause political chaos. But this was Russia. Russia has never once missed an opportunity for chaos, not even when the monarch is still teething. His mother, Anna Leopoldovna, served as regent. She wasn't exactly a powerhouse of political genius. One contemporary described her as well-meaning but unfocused, which is historian code for she tried, but she just wasn't built for boss fights. Court factions immediately started circling like bored cats looking for something to knock off a table. Russia had a long list of people who thought they deserved the throne more than a baby. And honestly, they weren't wrong. At least a grown adult knows what a throne is. Enter Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, charismatic, popular, and apparently very done with this whole baby as czar situation. She marched into the palace in 1741 and staged what might be the easiest coup in Russian history. The guards took one look at her and said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Ivan VI, poor little guy, was quietly dethroned before he even learned to walk. And here, that's where the story slides from sleepy bedtime chaos to soft sigh of historical sadness. Instead of allowing him to grow up with a normal life, Elizabeth had him moved to various secret locations. His existence itself was considered a political threat. Imagine being so dangerous that people hide you even though you literally can't spell your own name. By the time he was old enough to understand the situation, he had no friends, no freedom, and no idea why people whispered every time someone mentioned his name in the same room. He became a ghost prince, alive, but politically erased. Modern historians think he developed significant psychological issues from the isolation. And honestly, how could he not? But Russia being Russia, the story had one final twist no one asked for. In 1764, an officer tried to free him, except Ivan had been classified as too dangerous to ever be freed. So when the rescue attempt happened, the guards followed standing orders and killed him during the struggle. A child monarch who became a political threat just by existing. a kid whose entire life was shaped by a title he never chose. And a reminder that royal childhood was basically the worst daycare system in world history. Let's float to another child who ruled long before he understood the concept of ruling anything. And this time, we're gliding to Puyi, the last emperor of China. He's probably the most famous child ruler of the modern era, but his story still feels like a slow-motion fade into melancholy. He became emperor at age 2 years old. At 2, most kids are learning how to form words that aren't just emotional noises. Puyi, meanwhile, was apparently expected to rule the Qing dynasty. He had people bowing to him before he knew how to walk downstairs safely. According to records, when he was brought into the throne room for his coronation, he burst into tears because the room was too bright and crowded, which honestly might have been the most reasonable political reaction in the entire dynasty. Being emperor made Puyi the center of a world he didn't understand. Servants whispered. Ministers panicked about the empire's decline. Adults treated him like a living symbol instead of a person. And Puyi, well, he just wanted to play with toys, but history is rarely interested in what toddlers want. By the time he was 6, the dynasty fell to the 1911 revolution. Suddenly he was emperor, but also not emperor at the same time. A kid caught between centuries. He lived in the Forbidden City like a ghost, technically important, practically powerless, emotionally confused. He once said that he didn't understand he wasn't truly emperor until he tried to punish a eunuch and nobody listened. Years later, he was used again, this time by the Japanese, who installed him as a puppet ruler in Manchukuo. He was an adult by then, but still trapped in the same cycle he'd been born into, a figurehead, a symbol. A monarch with no control over his own life. After World War II, he ended up imprisoned, then re-educated, then released as a quiet, almost invisible citizen in communist China. A man who once held the mandate of heaven, reduced to trimming plants at a botanical institute. He lived long enough to see tourists wandering through the Forbidden City, visitors taking photos in the same rooms where he once cried on his coronation day. And there's something oddly gentle and sad about that. A story that began in imperial ceremony and ended in soft anonymity. Let's float on, gently, to another royal child who probably needed a nap more than a crown.